Okay, so we're recording, and I'd like to welcome you to the September 16th, 2015 Forest Connect webinar. We're going to be talking about firewood from private woodlots. Before we get started, I want to give you all the opportunity. I think you can save a copy of this presentation. So if you go to the upper left-hand corner, click on File, and then go to Save As. You can save the document, and you have the option of saving it as a PDF. So go ahead and do that. So in the past, we've had some troubles with saving where only the first slide was saved. So you don't have to do it right. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and I can't fix it right now. But what I'll do is if it doesn't work and you only get the first slide, send me an email, and I will post this as a PDF on the Ning site that you see there, cornellforestconnect.ning.com. So Jan says the document save isn't working. You do a save as. Oh, all right. Glad you told me here. Let me think. All right. Okay, I messed up. Give me just a second. I have to activate that. And I need to remember how. Here we go. All right. Okay, now try the save as. See, you guys were with me there. That's good. Try the save as now. Does it work? You want to, so the default on my computer is to save it as a UCF file. You don't want a UCF, you want a PDF. So you have to do the file type. All right, thank you, John. It's working. Let me see if there's one other person can let me know if that save as feature is working. And since this is being recorded, some people may listen to this in the future. If you're listening to this as an archive on YouTube, you will not be able to save it. All right, so Lou has it working. John has it working. And John has a very good question. He says, should we select, who do we send the questions to? So send it to all participants. Send your questions and your comments, please, to all participants. So that's a drop-down menu that's immediately above the box where you type in information. The value of that then is that everybody can see your question. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Looks like everything's working. So my name again is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester. I work for Cornell University through the Cooperative Extension System. And my base program is called Forest Connect. So if you go to forestconnect.info, you'll see all of the things that I have going on educationally. And if you're into the social media thing, so like just as a point of reference, and this is not at all an advertisement, but Facebook is an example of social media. I don't use Facebook, but there's a Ning site that we manage called cornellforestconnect.ning, and you can go there. You can post pictures, you can post events. Maybe you're having an event that your organization, if it's a woodlot or forestry related events, events for how to bake a cake maybe wouldn't go there, but other sorts of forest natural resource types of events can be posted there. And it also has a very nice feature as a question and answer. So you can post questions and you can also answer questions. And the beauty of this is that even though this is a moderated list, and we have about a half a dozen extension educators who monitor the questions, there's over, I don't know, there's well over 500, maybe 600 people that are on there. So there's a chance you could get somebody else that's connected to this that has some very good experiences and can help with some question that you have. So it's neat. You can post a picture. You can say, what is this? You can ask a question. You can do lots of different things. But right now we're on firewood from private woodlands. And just to give kind of a big picture overview of woody biofuel, we're focused pretty tightly on the Northeast. But on a global scale, biomass makes up about 10% of the primary energy that's consumed, and the overwhelming majority of that is woody biomass. So woody biofuels, wood as biomass used as a fuel is the biggest component of biomass. And for half of the world's population, wood or other biomass is the primary energy source. So I don't think that's at all the case in New York and the Northeast in the United States, but still wood is an important player. So why might you want to cut firewood? There's a lot of good reasons. Maybe that you want to reduce your home heating costs, and we'll look at some data for that. You may want to just philosophically reduce your dependence on fossil fuels. It may be that you see that the firewood is a byproduct of improving tree growth. And for those of you in the Northeast, the group NIFOA, New York Forest Owners, has a program called the Northeast Timber Growing Contest. If you just look up timbercontest.com, let me type that in. timbercontest.com, you'll get the information about how to participate in this. It's a family-oriented, fun sort of thing, and by cutting firewood, you increase the growth of trees in your woods. And maybe that you want to sell firewood for extra income. We're going to just dabble on that a little bit. That's potentially, I mean, you could do that as a presentation unto itself. By selecting the correct trees for thinning, you're going to reduce the amount of diseased stems and defective and undesirable stems that you have in your woods. And then it's also a chance for, I think, a lot of fun and great exercise. So I'm not sure, for people that heat with wood, I don't think you need to belong to a gym. Maybe you do. We'll talk about that when we get to some of the health concerns and considerations. And there are some people I know that a good friend of mine has kind of a firewood gang or team, and they get together several times a year and they have pancakes, and then they go out and they cut firewood, and from one wood lot they produce wood that will that supplies primary heat to 6 different families. So 100 acres of woods, and it's a great social activity. So we talked a little bit about the cost angle, and here I just pulled up one example, and if you go to the internet and do a search for wood heat or fuel heat comparison calculator, something like that, or use the one I have, buildinggreen.com. You can do oftentimes you'll be able to do comparisons of different fuels. This one is nice because it allows you to look at 2 or 3 different fuel options. So you can, let me pull up my pointer here. So you can add another fuel down here. You can pick a fuel that you like kind of as your base fuel. If you're looking at, say, firewood, it allows you to customize how much you're paying per cord, the type of heater that you have, the efficiency, and it gives you it standardizes this across the cost per million BTUs. So if you're buying firewood at $200 per cord, which is, give or take $10 or $20, probably pretty good for a lot of New York and the Northeast. Probably very low as you get into more metropolitan areas, but you're looking at about $13 per million BTUs. And this also assumes that you're using wood that's about 22 million BTUs. So, and you can edit that. You can compare that to propane, which is more than double the cost of wood. If you looked at things like pellets, wood pellets, you would see that those are very close in price. If you looked at coal, you would see it's very close in price to firewood. So firewood, and those of you who cut firewood, and I'm assuming many of you do, recognize that firewood, and this is a Jim Oktursky phrase, firewood is a way of life. It's a cultural, it's a lifestyle sort of thing. It's not a matter of just turning the dial on the wall and getting more heat. So there's a lot more that goes into it, as many of you know, and as we'll be talking about. So today's objective is to help woodlot owners enter into or refine their skills in the production of firewood. And we'll be looking kind of at three different areas: safety, and then woodlot improvement, and also production and marketing strategies. And the caveat here is that I've heated with wood as a primary home fuel source since the early to mid 90s. But I don't want to stand here or sit here and talk and you listen and give the suggestion that I know all there is to know about firewood. Many of you have been heating with firewood for a lot longer than I have. So much of what you're going to see is the experiences that I have had. I like to talk to people about firewood, so I'm always picking brains of people who heat with wood, trying to steal good ideas. There's a little bit of research on firewood, mostly from the Scandinavian countries, so we'll talk about that. But I just want you to know that this is there's a lot that can be added to this, and I hope that as we're going through, if you have suggestions, that you would feel free to offer those suggestions. So one of the things that really made me sit up and take notice about firewood in the Northeast is that when we ask landowners what they've done in their woods for the last 10 years, firewood, harvest, you can see at the top row there, harvest firewood for their own use was the single most common activity. And there's a difference if people lived in rural areas versus urban areas, but by and large, more than 2/3 of the people are actively involved in using firewood. And in researching this, I found a book that described the history of firewood and charcoal in ancient Greece, so going back to the 4th century AD. And there was discussion about how the people that owned woods saw that was a privilege that they could provide, that they could obtain and utilize their own wood. So that philosophy of utilization, self-utilization of the resources from our land persists today. And this is interesting because when you ask people why do they own their lands, they come up with a lot of different reasons. None of them are ever so that I can harvest firewood to feed my wood stove. It's about privacy, and it's about security, and it's about wildlife and things like that. But when you ask people what are they doing, you can see what they're doing, the activities that they're doing. So anyway, firewood, the single most common activity, at least among rural woodland owners, and at the top among all woodland owners. We'll be, as an outline, we're going to be looking at some terminology, making sure we're using words the same. We'll be looking at several different scales of production, a couple different scales of production, actually, kind of a low level of production and a moderate level of production. Within that, we'll be talking about different types of equipment, so we'll look at some examples. We'll spend a few slides thinking about how to pick trees to cut, and this is a very kind of short segment on what is a much longer discussion, and we have several webinars that deal with that. We'll talk a little bit about the processing and the storage and the moisture content. This is one of the areas where you can have the greatest control over the utility of your wood. And then finally, sale and marketing. So we'll get through all of these. So some terminology. When we talk about wood, and this is a kind of storyline I use when I'm doing workshops, is I say how much wood is in a cord, or how do we measure wood? We know that when we buy milk, we buy it by the gallon or the half-gallon. Fuel for our vehicles is by the gallon, and sugar is by the pound. Well, the way we buy and sell and think about wood, firewood, is by the cord. And the standard cord, or a full cord, is based upon, back in the old days, where you would have pieces of wood that were 4 feet long, and you would stack them. So if you're standing looking at the stack, you would be looking at the ends of the wood, and it would be 4 feet away from you. The stack would be 8 feet long and then 4 feet tall. That's 128 cubic feet. And usually assume that there's about 85 cubic feet of solid wood. So that's just based on probably some empirical data where people have measured the airspace. And it's going to, and I don't know how it affects it, but certainly would affect if you have small pieces versus large pieces. Oftentimes when you're buying wood, and I'm assuming that most of you are not going to be buying wood, but you might be selling it, you might think about a face cord. And a face cord is you still have the wood stacked long axis away from you, individual sticks long axis away from you, 4 feet high, 8 feet wide, but the length of that wood is not defined. So on the face, it looks like a cord, so that's 32 square feet. And then, as we'll see, at least in New York, you have to specify by law what the length of it is. So it's a 12-inch stick of wood, or an 18-inch stick of wood, or a 24-inch stick of wood. People will talk about seasoned and dry wood. I've not found a definition that linked seasoning to dryness, but dryness is usually considered to be less than about 20% moisture content. We'll be talking a lot about moisture content towards the end, but just as we're trying to get some of these terms together, and also to get people thinking about if you're buying wood or selling wood, how much weight you have to deal with. And so if you have a pickup truck and you have a half-ton pickup truck, that's 1,000 pounds that your truck can handle. So a green cord, and this is when I say cord, I'm always going to mean full cord. If I mean face cord, then I'll talk about a face cord. So cord always means full cord. A cord of ash is about 2 tons, 4,000 pounds. When you dry that ash, it drops to about 3,500 pounds. So air dried would be down to about 20%. That's why people say, you know, ash is a good wood because you don't have to lose very much moisture to get it down to its dry weight. Birch has a much greater variance. Oak also has a lot. So you're going to be losing about 50% of the weight of the green wood when you get down to air dried. So the average, you go from about 4,400 pounds down to about 3,300 pounds, or a little over 2 tons to a ton and 3/4, ton and 2/3 rather. So if you're buying wood and somebody says, I have a pickup truck, standard pickup truck, and I'll deliver you a cord, they are not talking about a full cord, or they have one heck of a standard pickup truck. So, and John has posted a web link there for chimney sweep and some information on the internet. And if you all have websites that you want to share related to this topic on firewood, please do share them. Those are saved in the archive when this is saved, and so people that watch this in the future will be able to see those web links. All right, let's talk a little bit about safety. We'll talk more about safety when we talk about felling trees, but let's start with most people that are going to be cutting firewood or using firewood, woodlot owners, the people that are watching this presentation are going to be using chainsaws and other types of equipment. This is fine. These are tools. Like every tool, if it's used incorrectly or if there's an accident, then bad things can happen. You see on the right-hand side an image that depicts some of the injuries associated with chainsaw use. This is back in the late 1990s. This will be probably a little bit different 16 years later, but the patterns will probably be fairly similar. What's interesting is that we recommend certainly chaps, chainsaw-resistant chaps or pants, because there's a very high percentage of injuries to the upper leg and knee, but then the hand area also has a lot of injuries. And it's not clear to me, if you're using your chainsaw correctly, how you would injure your hand, because you would always have 2 hands on the chainsaw. So maybe somebody in the audience has some insights into how we injure our hands if we're using the chainsaw correctly. You also want to protect your head, face, and ears, so you get a logger's helmet, some steel-toed boots. If you're dropping pieces of firewood, I had a friend of mine once was wearing penny loafers, and he was carrying some firewood, and he dropped a stick of wood and broke his toe, and so he was able to spend 4 or 5 hours in the emergency room and then, limped around for weeks. So protect your toes. And then for those of you that are going to be felling trees, there's a program called Game of Logging for landowners. It varies in price. In New York, the New York State Center for Agricultural Medicine and Health offers subsidized game of logging trainings, often for a very nominal fee of $20, anywhere from $15 to $25. Other groups will offer it for more. When I offer it, I don't have money to subsidize, so I'll often charge about $125 to $150 just to cover my costs. But for those of you that have done game of logging, you know it's a great educational program. So when we start thinking about components of production, the things that we have to account for, we have to acquire the wood, right? So that might be felling trees, it might be buying logs. We have to handle those logs. Maybe we have to move them around or block them up. And then we may be moving the logs or moving the blocks of wood, or it may be that we split the blocks of wood and then we move the split firewood. So there's different kind of order of operations. And then finally we have to store it. So we'll be thinking about all of those. And I received an email. Originally I was going to offer this webinar a few months ago, and somebody said, super, I changed it because I wanted to accommodate another speaker, and somebody said, okay, just make sure you cover logistics. So I got thinking a little bit about the logistics and just kind of the problems that you have to account for when you're managing wood. So some of these challenges are, how do we access the trees and the logs? So some of that's terrain, some of it's equipment. The equipment is a challenge. Do you have, as pictured here, closest in the picture, you see an ATV with a little arch, and we'll see that arch again, a side view, in just a few minutes. But then in front of it, you see something orange as a tractor. So maybe you have a small tractor, and then you have different kinds of implements on the tractors, so different kinds of equipment you have to deal with. Dealing with the different log sizes, and then this individual that had contacted me was particularly curious about how do we deal with theft, which is not something that I've ever had to deal with. But I can imagine that if you had a woodlot and you didn't have a residence on that woodlot, and there was effectively public access, if it wasn't gated, then you could split a great big beautiful pile of wood, and if you're gone for a couple weeks, you could come back and somebody would have very much appreciated all the work you put into it as they trucked off load after load of firewood. So how do we optimize these logistics? These are a few ideas, and I feel a little bit remiss that I don't have kind of a laundry list of great ways to be logistically optimized. But when you think through all of the different ways that people can manage firewood, and I know several friends of mine heat exclusively with wood, and everybody has a slightly different system, and they all work for them. So the logistics depend a little bit on what you have to work with, what your terrain is, who you have for family members and friends that are part of the process. And so here I can just offer a few kind of general comments. First of all, whatever tools and equipment you use, they were designed for a particular purpose. Use them as they were designed and use them. Learn how to use them safely. One of the common things that can happen is you have a machine, an ATV, or a garden cart, a garden tractor, or something that's you're trying to use, and you're pulling too much weight. And usually it's not the pulling that's a problem, it's the stopping that's a problem. Or you'll get a weak hitch or something like that. So use the tools as they were designed. The fewer times you handle the wood, the happier you will be. So typically this happens because you will move big pieces of wood to the processor. So if you have a log that's 18 feet long and you can move it to the processor, cut it and split it at one spot, you've handled, if it's 18 feet long, I should have done the math in advance. Let's say you have 14 pieces of firewood out of that 18-foot log. So you handle one piece of wood and you produce 14 pieces of firewood. The alternative is you handle 14 pieces of firewood. So if you have the equipment, you can move those bigger pieces of log. If you don't, which I don't, then I end up blocking up my wood, my firewood in the woods, and then a trailer to carry out that firewood. One kind of note, if you will, is if you're dragging logs with the tractor, that's one way to move big pieces of wood to the firewood to the processor, but you may have to contend with dirty bark. So if you're dragging it through the mud, if you're spring or summer or fall logging, you may have dirt in the bark, which is going to dull your chainsaw, which is going to be an inefficient use of equipment. It's going to make it less safe, and you're going to spend more time sharpening. So the workaround to that is two options. move it in the winter when you're working on snow or ice, and then you need, equipment chains for the tires, or block up into smaller pieces. And this is a personal preference. I can make a bit of an argument for it, but I wouldn't argue too hardly to concentrate your work zone. So if you're going to be working in an area, concentrate your work for that year in one area. I think there are two values to that. One is practical and one is emotional or psychological. So the practical one is you're going to have fewer trails that you have to create and then put to rest. So if you're producing 3 cords or 13 cords or 23 cords, you have to move that wood from the wood lot to wherever the staging areas you're going to be working. So you need trails to do that. If you're doing across the property hunt and peck for firewood, then you need to have a good trail system, and maybe you do, and then you have to make sure that those trails are put to rest so that they don't wash out during rain events. Psychologically, I think the advantage here is that you can see the fruits of your labor. So if you're just plucking a firewood tree here and there, you walk back through the woods, and especially if part of your interest is to improve the condition of the forest, you've diluted your efforts, and it's hard to see where the work has produced any tangible benefit. So I'm brainstorming here on how to reduce the potential for theft. So if anybody has any additional ideas, please type those in. If there's any way you can put up a gate, and oftentimes just a simple gate that requires people to, like a rope, even though it would easily be driven through. If somebody has to stop and unhook that rope, their exposure time at the edge of the road may be enough that they just don't feel comfortable doing it. And it may be that they don't, with the rope, it may be that they don't know there's firewood in there, and they see the rope, and so they just know that they're not supposed to go in there, so they never are tempted. Maybe it's a temptation factor. Obviously, you can put a lot of money and effort into gates. It may be that you want to put up some trail cameras. There's a lot of very high-quality trail cameras that you can use. And then finally, just thinking about the location of where you're going to store your split wood until you're able to move it and utilize it. So it may be that you have to move the processing center not next to the road, but move it 50 yards away from the road, something like that. And then finally, logistics call for us to stack in a conveniently proximate location. So it needs to be accessible when you're bringing in. So the way my operation is set up, when I bring in blocks of wood, I have it so that my ATV and cart can pull up next to my log splitter. The wood comes off the cart onto the log splitter and then into the storage shed. And the storage shed is close enough to the house, so it makes splitting it easy, accessing it with equipment easy, stacking it easy, and then it's easy for me to get to it and use it. So carrying this a little bit further, some things to think about for efficiency and production. I offer up this list right here. Earlier we talked about some of that you didn't need to buy a membership at a gym because of the exercise, but if you're to a point in your life where, as many of us are, where you're not the young, vibrant person that you think you still are, then going out, if what you're doing is cutting firewood a few weekends a year and you don't have any other physical activity during the year, going out into the woods and then working very hard may not be good for you. So there may be some exercises, like to exercise your core muscle groups over the course of the year. Use modern tools, sharp tools, appropriate tools, things like that. So these are just some other things that are a little bit, not quite logistics, but more just things to consider for efficiency and production. All right, so John and Michael have offered some thoughts, looks like, on theft. So here's another theft, and I probably shouldn't offer this up. This is not, well, I'm not going to say it because that would get me and it would get Cornell in trouble. It was something my grandfather suggested. I think he was just saying it in jest, but so I'm not going to offer that up. All right, so let's look at some different scales of production. At the kind of the entry-level scale of production, you might be thinking about 1 to 15 cords per year. And as a general rule of thumb, a house will use 100 million BTUs of energy to heat it each year. Okay, that's just a rule of thumb. So if you have a small house that's super energy efficient, it's going to be less than that. Where I first started using firewood as my sole source of heat was an old farmhouse that was uninsulated in the mountains of western Maryland, and I used about 300 million BTUs a year. So to put this into a context, 1 cord of wood has about 20 to 25 million BTUs. It depends on the species. So if you have the average house, you're going to use about 5 full cords of wood per year if that's your primary or sole source of heat. So you're going to be on the low end of this scale of production. What I'm illustrating here with these pictures are the kinds of tools that would be involved and strategies that would be involved in obtaining firewood for the scale of production. So you could probably go out and cut your own trees, or you can always, of course, buy logs in. And then you need a way to move that wood. This is probably just as a very generic sort of picture, and I'll show, the next slide shows a bunch of different ways to move logs. So some kind of mechanization process is probably the most common for this scale. When we bought our property in northern New York, we didn't have an ATV, and so I thought, well, I'll get this neat little firewood cart, and I'll cut and split the wood, and then my wife and daughters will move the wood. So just before you think, hey, this is a cheap way to get good exercise and get the family involved, this picture was the only time that I actually filled that firewood cart and then used it. So it hasn't been used since. So that's not really an effective strategy for moving wood. If you're vigorous and robust, you can use splitting mauls to split wood, or more likely you'll have some kind of a family-owned log splitter, maybe a custom-made jobber, and maybe a low-end commercial wood splitter. But if you're splitting 5 to 10 cords a year, you're probably going to want some kind of mechanization. How do you move the logs if we're working at this kind of low end? Probably one of the most common ways is people drive their pickup truck into the woods. They have a trail and they fill up the pickup truck with split wood and then drive it back out. Or they have some kind of small machine. Here's a garden tractor, here's an ATV with a cart, and those machines are used to move the wood around. You can also use a variety of different log handling, and so this is where you would be moving large pieces of wood to the splitter and blocking them up. This is a tractor-mounted hitch. This is Tony Pingtor's from out in western New York, and the tongue on this actually goes vertical. It goes straight up. You can lift it up, and then the tail end of this drops down on top of the log, and so when you pull the tongue forward, it lifts the log off the ground, and you hitch it up to the tractor. This is my logging arch. That has a pine saw log in it, but you could just as easily carry firewood logs. Here's another. So here's an arch, and then in the lower left corner, an arch. All of those are arches that get the front end of the log elevated, which is really important for safety because you don't want the front end of that log to be catching on roots and rocks and stumps. But unlike those two arches in the upper left-hand corner, these arches will drag the tail end of the log. So you may have a little bit of mud on the tail end of the log, depending upon if you're going uphill or downhill and the shape of that log. But all of them are ways to move bigger logs relatively efficiently, and for the scale of production of 1 to 15 cords a year, these are adequately sized contraptions. And as when you get out and talk to landowners, you're going to realize that they have, there's a there's a wide variety of different ways that people have solved this problem. So it's a very cool sort of thing to look at. So if I do some production estimates here just to kind of budget things out, and there's a lot of variability comes into it very quickly, from whether you have an entry-grade chainsaw to a higher-end chainsaw, how much you're going to spend on safety and felling equipment, the hand cart we could get rid of. Maybe you already own an ATV, so that's off your budget, although if you start using it regularly, then you're going to need to budget for maintenance and repairs, some kind of a cart. You may want to get a splitting maul or not. I have probably 4 splitting mauls, and I haven't used them, and I can't remember the last time I used a splitting maul. If you're on the low end of the 1 to 15 cords, it'll be cheaper for you to rent a log splitter. Do it for a couple of weekends. It'll cost you a couple $100 bucks. You don't have to maintain it. So you can be anywhere between about $400 and $8,000, depending upon how high on the hog you want to ride, and you should plan on spending 5 or 6 hours per person per full cord. So this would be everything from maybe a little bit more than 6 hours if you're felling and skidding the logs out. So this, these are ballpark numbers. If you want to ratchet up the scale of production, maybe some people have the outdoor wood boilers that tend to use fairly high volumes of wood, or it may be people are working together as a cooperative and there are 2 or 3 families that are utilizing wood. Your scale of production goes up. So you can still, as a woodlot owner, fell the trees, as you see in the left-hand side. Bill Lindloff there cutting the tree down. You can buy logs. And I offer buy logs because sometimes while you may have woods, and it makes sense, of course, to use as much wood from your woodlot as you can, you may need to get a jump start ahead and build yourself in a buffer. And so it may be that you take around much of New York, you can buy a truckload of logs, which is about 6 full cords for about $100 a cord, so for about $600, and that's about a year's supply. You're going to need bigger pieces of equipment to move wood around. This was a maple producer, had an old barrel drum that was cut in half and put onto a cart filled with wood. Maybe you use things like a tractor with a farming winch, and we'll look at some of those in just a minute, pictures. To skid your logs out, you're going to need more of an industrial-sized log splitter. When you get above 5 cords a year, you're probably not going to want to consider splitting by maul, or even a firewood processor, as we see here in the upper right-hand corner. So how do we move logs? We can still use these 1 log at a time contraptions. You can even use some kind of a cart, but more likely than not, you're going to have some type of a farm tractor, 2-wheel drive or 4-wheel drive, with what's called generically a 3-point hitch or a farmy hitch. There's a couple manufacturers. So there's one. Here's another one. And this has a neat little feature in the kind of the center of the blade. The owner has welded a plate and has a 2-inch ball hitch. So if that owner wants to hook a wagon or a cart up to the back of that farmy winch, they're able to do that without taking the farmy winch off. If on your property you're also going to be doing some logging for saw logs, then you have a little tow behind forwarder, such as we see in the lower right-hand corner. That's an option for you as well. In one season you can be using it for 1 load, you can carry saw logs, another load you can carry firewood. So the costs here become a lot more, I'll say, loosey-goosey. You still are going to have a chainsaw. The prices on the chainsaws I've bumped up. If you're going to be cutting this much wood, you're going to want a higher-end saw. You're still going to want to have safety equipment and felling equipment. And then somewhere in this, try to do a pencil here. Oh, where to go? Here we go. So we have, some way to move the wood around. So we have an ATV and an arch, or we have a tractor and some kind of a 3-point hitch, a skidding plate, and you can get them used for a few $1,000s. You can get them new for tens of thousands of dollars. So that's why, you know, the variation here just kind of gets out of control pretty quickly. You can rent power splitters. You're going to spend more time renting it for a few $100s, or you may want to buy one. And if you take care of it, don't put ethanol, put any gas, buy gas that's ethanol free, and your engine and carburetor will last for years and years. You know, you can spend a few $1,000s on a good one. John says, very good point. So John's talking about safety features on a tractor. So let me back up, and I don't have a close-up. So here's a tractor that doesn't have what he's calling, he says, ropes or rollover protection system. You would have some kind of a structure about like this. If you can see that yellow, it's a metal tubular system that when the tractor rolls over, it prevents the tractor from squishing you completely. But that, of course, only works if you wear a seatbelt. So you also need to make sure you have a functional seatbelt. So thank you, John. Very good point. I don't know. He says limb risers. I'm not sure what a limb riser. And when I'm looking, it looks like FOPS. Is that the same as a ropes system? So John, maybe you want to add some detail to that, if you could, please. All right. So how do we pick trees? And again, this is a short version of a much longer conversation, but basically what you're doing when you're cutting firewood is you're trying to improve the woods. So you want to keep the best trees and cut the worst trees. So you want to retain trees that are vigorous and thrifty, and you identify those because you look at their crown and you look for trees that have full healthy crowns, and you look for the absence of root decay. So trees such as this tree have a fairly well-developed crown. This one isn't bad. This crown isn't bad. This one is like a half a crown or a third of a crown or a quarter of a crown. So you can see there's variation in crowns. And then if you see decay, structural decay in the stem or in the bud of the tree, those are also good candidates for felling and for removal. All right, so falling object protection so that would be more of like a canopy. Ropes is just if you roll it over. So good, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, you want to retain trees that support your ownership objectives. So obviously if you're trying to ultimately grow high quality saw timber, then maybe you're obviously going to leave the species and the quality of stems that are good. And just because the species is good, so let's say you have a soil type that grows really nice red oak. You may have some really ugly red oak, and as long as you have other red oak that are good seed source, there's no point in saving ugly red oak just because it's a red oak. So keep the good red oak, but the other red oak should go in the firewood pile. And then remove the stems that are good for firewood, which is usually, so you may fell the trees to improve growing conditions for the residuals, but you're not going to remove those stems unless they're actually good for firewood. So if you want to see a lot more about this, all of the webinars are archived on this YouTube channel. So if you go to youtube.com/forestconnect, you can scroll down through webinars that go back to about 2007. But if you just do a search with the word productivity, I think I did a quick search this morning, and there were 3 different webinars that would kind of address this perspective. So we'll look at a couple of more slides just to illustrate a couple of these points. Here I'm trying to illustrate crown conditions. So the tree that in the upper portion of your screen has a full crown, and that's not what I want. Where's my? All right, so you see this is a great big crown up here. Compare that to this crown, which is very compressed. Okay, so that compressed crown on the stem that you see coming up from the lower left-hand corner is an indication that that tree has lost the struggle, lost the battle in competing for sunlight. So that's a good candidate for firewood, and you would leave behind, all other things being equal, the tree with the bigger crown for future higher value products. Just because it has a big crown doesn't mean it's going to be a good tree, but at least that's a starting point for consideration. Here's another example thinking about these, what we're calling good trees that have fairly well-developed crowns. In other trees, you see this one emanating up from the lower right-hand corner, very scrawny looking. Here's another one in the lower right-hand corner, very scrawny. So these are trees, cut them. The trees from the lower right-hand corner are so small, they're not going to really free up that much growing space, but they'll free up some. They'll remove disease. You can see on this stem there's a bulge that's probably some kind of a disease canker. Get the disease out of the woods. Leave behind your biggest and best trees. Here's another one that's useful to focus on when you're trying to remove trees, and that's cutting trees with forks. So this was a tree that was in my woods, and the picture in the upper right-hand corner is the tree as it's felled. And what I want you to see is this seam. All right, so this tree has this seam. I'm highlighting it now in red. And that seam, it happens because the two limbs that I've highlighted in red flex in the wind and in the snow, and it creates tension in that wood. And the tension in the wood splits the fibers, but the tree tries to grow back together. As the tree tries to go back together, and we see the same stem in the lower left-hand corner, it creates a callus tissue. So this swollen tissue that you see on the left and right-hand side of that stem is where the tree is essentially scabbed over that wound. But if you cut the tree down and look at it, you can see that callus tissue on the left and right-hand side, and then importantly, you see inside the tree has started to decay. So if you see, as the first indication, a fissure below the fork of a tree, that's probably an indication that that fork is under stress, and it may very well have started to decay on the inside. If you see these large protrusions, what I'll say is kind of perpendicular to the fork, that's a very good indication that that tree has been under stress. Now, there's no promise that that tree is ever going to fail. You can walk out in your woods and you can find hundreds of trees that are 18 or 20 inches in diameter that have forks, and they're not going to fail. So the fork is not a guarantee of failure, but there's a greater probability of failure of that stem than for other types of stems. So one way to think about this, and this I'll just say crop tree management, and I'll encourage you to go do a Google search for crop tree management. I got to talk faster because I'm going to run way out of time. Crop tree management means you pick your crop tree. So in this case, the dark green trees are the crop trees, and then you want to release those trees on at least two sides. Okay, so there's one side released, there's another side released. You can see that these trees are still competing, and these trees are still competing. You can release it on four sides. There's some reasons why you might not want to do that. So look up crop tree management on the internet. That'll give you some more background. There's a lot more to that. All right, so how do you put a tree on the ground? Here's an example. You have one opening in the canopy, and this tree has 12 feet of side lean, or 16 feet of back lean, or has forward lean, but it's next to a good tree, and so you need to maneuver it in a different direction. So how do you do this? By directional felling. So we've talked a little bit about game of logging. What directional felling means is that you pick the direction the tree falls. It's a very deliberate process where you're not chasing the tree. So the traditional way is that you would cut a notch, front notch in the tree, as this individual is doing, and then let's say here was the front notch, and then you start from the back side and you start cutting on the outside of the stem, moving your saw towards the front notch. That's chasing the tree. There are lots of problems with that. What directional felling offers as advantages is reduced hung trees, more safety. You're able to position the log for more efficient extraction, reduced risk of personal injury, and better productivity. So you may spend $100 or $150 on a course. I feel very confident that you will see that as money well spent. Carl points out directional felling is important in urban forestry. So go ahead and keep your comments coming, please. I'll come back to those. Those are retained. I'll come back to those when we get to the question and answer period. All right, so game of logging. The picture in the upper right-hand corner connects directly to know your limitations, right? This was an effort to fell a tree that exceeded the limitations. So you're going to reduce downtime. You're going to be able to sharpen your own chain. You're going to avoid some dangerous situations. All right. As you're offering comments, please make sure that you're sending it to all participants. So, all right, so we've done production. We've talked a little bit about safety. Are all species equally good for firewood? And the answer is no. So we measure this in terms of million BTUs per seasoned cord. We have some species that are really good: apple, beech, oak, locust, sugar maple, hop hornbeam, hickory, black birch. So locust, black locust, if you have any Osage orange is very good. These all have more than 20 million BTUs per full cord. So most of them have more than 25. There are some that are good, and these are in the 18 to 20 or 22 million BTUs. White ash, red maple, elm are all good. White birch is in that same category, but in New York, white birch is not considered a hardwood. So if you you can burn it. I burn an awful lot of white birch, paper birch. It burns quite nicely. It doesn't last very long outside without cover. It rots quickly, but it burns well. I have no issues with burning it. The concern is that in New York State, it is not considered a hardwood, and you cannot legally sell it as hardwood firewood. The other species also listed in red fall under that category, and then there are some that are poor. You see those listed. So one person once asked me, hey, I've got a bunch of basswood. Can I burn it as firewood? And my answer is, if you can fit it through the stove door, you can burn it as firewood, but I'm not sure why you would want to. Basswood has about 12 million BTUs per full cord versus something like red oak or a beech. And this person also had beech, and so I said you could cut and split half as much wood if it was just beech, and you would heat your house for the same amount of time. Tom's pointing out about Bradford pear, which is a good point, although some of the wildlife folks may not feel that way. All right, now we're going to get into a little more of the science behind all of this, which I think is kind of fun. So many people work way ahead of schedule, and they have wood that's been drying for a year or sometimes 2 years or even 3 years. Good for them. Other people are maybe the winter ahead. Sometimes you get behind and you're the summer ahead of the heating system, and you're saying, am I going to be able to, I have to cut the wood. These are specific data from maple syrup evaporators, but they illustrate a point that if you're working with dry hardwood, right, so you have less than 25% water, and we said we want to be down below 20%, your average efficiency for an evaporator is about 52%. If you're down here with green wood, you're at half that efficiency. So you need twice as much wood if you're burning green wood as if you're burning dry wood. There's variations in between here. So partially dry wood, deteriorated wet wood, and so forth. So dry wood is an essential part of efficient heating. So we want to get rid of the wood, or keep the wood, wood and water. Just say no to the water. Wet wood is inefficient because the heat is required to evaporate the water before the wood can combust. Trying to burn wet wood is going to increase the amount of smoke, which is really just water vapor, acetic acid, tar, creosote, which is going to accumulate in your chimney. And for those of you that have had the experience of trying to light or ignite wet wood, you realize that then you also have an accompanied feeling of frustration. So there's been some research, especially out of Scandinavian countries, that have looked at wood, and they talk about wet wood as having 350 grams of water per kilogram of wood, total wood, which I calculate if I divide 350 by 1,000, I get 0.35. So I see that as 35%. That may not be an accurate way to portray percentages. So I've tried to capture both my calculation of percentage and the reported grams per kilograms. But wet wood, all the things we talked about, increased carbon monoxide, increased total hydrocarbons, increased volatile organic compounds. I'm not enough of a chemist to know what those were, so I looked them up. Some of those are dangerous and some of them are not. More concerning perhaps are what they refer to as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are organic bonds of carbon and hydrogen. They result from incomplete combustion, and they're strongly associated as carcinogens and mutagens. So when I provide the reference there, if you want to look more into that. But anyway, the point here is simply on a basis of frustration, you would not want to burn wet wood and efficiency. Who wants to cut twice as much wood as they need? So the goal is going to be getting down below 18% moisture. This was some research that was done looking at 4 different Scandinavian species, Norway spruce, which would correspond to some of our conifers, European beech, English oak, and sycamore maple. So it was nice that we had some species that matched with a lot of what we see in the Northeast. Their percent moisture at the time of harvesting was very high for the conifers and about the same for all of the hardwoods, so upper 40% moisture. What they found, and this was looking at a study to see how long you had to store wood, depending upon the time of year that you cut it and the nature of the storage. What they found is that you had the lowest moisture content in trees, statistically significantly lower in March. They surmised that that was because there was the start for some evapotranspiration losses, but the ground is still frozen, so they're not moving moisture into the trees. Shelters, particularly sheds, will speed the drying. Felling in winter or early spring, splitting the wood and stacking it under cover, they felt would provide the 8 to 10 months that are necessary in order for you to use the wood that year. So if you get out late winter, early spring, cut and split your wood, they're suggesting if you split it and stack it under cover, shed cover, roof cover, then you'll be okay. They made a comment about the nature of stacking, and I heard a comment from my brother-in-law that he had read something that was attributed to Benjamin Franklin, who was talking about how tightly should you stack your wood, and Benjamin Franklin seemed to think that it needs to be big enough, or the holes, the gaps when you're stacking the wood should be big enough for a mouse, but too small for a cat. So that's a pretty good way to think about it, I thought. All right, different ways to stack your wood. Here are 3 different examples. The top goes from poor, much better at the bottom. The key is to elevate it off the ground as much as possible, because with snowpack, you want to get it probably at least 10 inches off the ground. More would be better. Protect it from rain and snow. Tarps, as you see here in the middle picture, may not work well. Having this piece of plywood and then tarping over that is better, but the tarps are going to hold moisture. So you want airflow as one of the key features of drying your wood. Here's a couple more pictures of wood sheds. We've talked a little about efficiency loss with wet wood. And a couple of these, so this was a study out of New Zealand. You see reporting here with radiotopine, and then also the study from Scandinavia. The smaller you cut those pieces, the lower the mass of the wood, the more surface area you're going to have on exposed wood, and the more rapidly you're going to be able to dry that wood. So there have been occasions when I've been under the gun and I end up splitting my wood about the size of my forearm. So, maybe something, I don't know, I'm guessing 3.5 inches in diameter roughly, and giving it well-ventilated storage under cover and I'm able to burn it within about 6 months. I have some creosote issues I have to deal with, but at least it gets it past a point where it's too frustrating to try to get that fire started. All right, so how do we market it? We'll, I think I'm going to skim over this because in the interest of time, there's a lot of different ways you can market it. My wife and I ran a kind of a small firewood operation for a few years. We did it all on Craigslist and then ultimately by word of mouth. So, and you have to find your niche. We didn't have a big truck or a big log splitter, so we sold essentially ambiance wood. So we were marketing to a very different client base than the people that are selling 5 cords in a truckload at a time. Different ways you can distribute that firewood if you're selling it. Legally, as I looked into this, I came to realize, and somebody said, you know, you can be sued for anything at any time, so you have to just kind of address that. You may, in the bottom line, you want to talk to your insurance agent. My insurance agent said that we were a small enough operation in terms of volume and value that it didn't make any sense for us to change our insurance policy. So that was good news. But you can think about all of the things that can go bad that you might be blamed for, right? You park your truck in the driveway, you're unloading it, the emergency brake goes out, and your truck rolls into your client's house. Or, you know, you stack the wood, or maybe you don't stack the wood, they stack the wood, but the wood falls over on the client's son. There's a chimney fire. I mean, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And then legally, you're probably, I don't know if it's required, but it's very good common sense. If you're traveling down the road with firewood in the bed of an open pickup truck, put a tarp over it to minimize the likelihood that a piece of that wood is going to bounce out on the ground. I mean, the last thing you'd want is for a piece of that wood to go bouncing out and go through somebody's windshield. So, if you're in New York, there are legal considerations that you have to take into account. I would guess most states have something. Ours is regulated in the New York State Department of Ag and Markets, and it stipulates that hardwood firewood excludes what are some broadleaf species, all conifers and some broadleaf species. It stipulates that if you sell this wood and market it as seasoned, you have to specify the duration of season. You have to identify 3 different dimensions in feet and inches. There's a website, and I just found this by typing in New York State sales tax fuel firewood or something like that. But if you're in New York, there's the web link for that. Some counties require that you charge tax on your firewood, others don't. And if you're collecting revenue, you are required by law to report that to the Internal Revenue Service for federal taxes and the New York State Department of Taxation for state taxes. How do you transport it legally? So you can transport it in a truck, and I've showed a couple examples here. These are pictures I took, and I'm always tempted to go up and talk to people when they're moving wood around like this. And I've blanked out their license plates so that you all can't track them down. But legally in New York, you can at most transport wood within a 50-mile radius from the point of origin. So from the stump of that tree, you have 50 miles. So if your wood lot is 54 miles away from your house, legally, that's as the crow flies, as I understand it. As the crow flies, 54 miles away, you can't legally transport that wood from your wood lot to your home. So when you transport it, anytime you transport it, if it's legally being transported, you need to have what's called a certificate of source, and I've provided a link to that. And in New York State, you can just type in New York State NYSDEC Firewood Certificate of Source. What that does, it's a very simple document. You can make your own version up. It just says, I own this wood. Here's the address where it was collected. Here's the quantity of wood, and here's the location where it's going. So it's a fairly simple document. You can get around these restrictions if you kiln dry the wood, but there's very specific definitions about what constitutes kiln drying. All right, so here's some helpful websites, and if you've downloaded this file, I'll just bump right past this. And here's just a fun little table that describes the amount of firewood you'll get from a tree of a certain diameter. So, and I have this as a fact sheet that I'll publish on the Ning site. I'll do up a little blog on Firewood, and I'll publish that on the Ning site. But it just illustrates, you know, if you're out marking trees and you mark a whole bunch of 10-inch and 12-inch and 14-inch trees, you can calculate the volume of wood that you're going to obtain from that. So with that, thank you all. I'm sorry I ran over. I got talking a little more slowly than I might have. But let me scroll back, and we're going to go down through the questions. Okay, so a couple of people dittoed my comments about the value of game of logging, and here's John suggesting that, speculating that the hand injuries are sprained thumb from kickback. Okay, that's possible. Or incorrectly reaching for the chain brake. Okay, maybe. Good thinking. John says, this is, I think, about theft. So he leaves the logs inaccessible in the woods. He doesn't winch them in until he's ready to process them and then move them out. So it's, you know, of course, as he notes, a lot harder to steal tree length wood than it is a neatly stacked pile. And Michael's talking about random pieces of wood you can mark with a Sharpie like you would a golf ball. And that works if you're able to track somebody down. You could look for your signature on the side of a piece of firewood. So John, we talked a little bit about limb risers and FOPS, falling object protection systems. John sent me some pictures, so I will post those on the Ning site, or John can post those. Even better, John can post those on the Ning site. All right, so John's going to send us some stuff. Right, so Klaus is talking about the ability of some trees to respond in the crown to regrowth after neighboring trees are removed, and that's true, in fact. The point that I was making is that if you have two trees, one way to judge the trees is based on the size of those crowns. So you may have, if you have a good tree with a healthy crown and a tree next to it with a diminished crown, unless there's some really compelling reason, you're probably going to want to cut the stem that has the diminished crown and allow the tree with the fully developed crown to continue to thrive. But I understand what you're saying, and there are some of those trees that can respond. So, and he's making the point that there may be a tree with a vigorous crown, but it has some other problem. All right. Okay, so great. John's pointing out there's a women's only game of logging class in Derby, Vermont, Saturday, September 26th. So if you all know about game of logging classes, please post them on the Ning site. I'm going to type that address. Well, I'm not going to type it. You can, if you go to cornellforestconnect.ning.com, there's a calendar there. And so I encourage all game of logging, any woodlot related activities to be advertised there. Tim's commenting the game of logging taught him to work efficiently while felling. I fully agree, and reduces fatigue and increases safety. Right. Tom mentioned, as we said, about Bradford pear. All right, so Artem says, injuries hand due to sharpening without gloves. Yes, there's great opportunity if you're running a file and the file jumps, you can drive a sawtooth onto your thumb. Or trim saws, probably, yeah, a lot of smaller saws that are used one-handed. Okay, Tom points out as a method for drying wood, and this is what I do and many people I know do. You have an outdoor wood storage, and then you'll have an interior space. We have a kind of a double crate system where you might have 2 or 3 or 5 days worth of wood. And by bringing it in, you can kind of super dry it. If it's already dry, you bring it in. Wood stoves, as you know, remove a lot of moisture from the air. And by having that wood even just a few days can make a big difference in the drying of that wood. Okay, John's offered looks like a link for moisture content of green wood. Tom's talking about local gas stations to sell small bundles of wood. So if you can develop a relationship with some of them, some of the areas that I've seen here in eastern New York will sell bundles of kiln-dried firewood from Estonia, which is a country in Europe, northern Europe, I think. How they can economically move wood from Europe to the U.S. and sell it is beyond me, but it makes me think that we Americans could do a lot more to be producing essentially value-added products and getting those out into local places for sale. All right, so campfire wood seller once tried to sell Tom some aspen. He wanted something higher density, more BTUs, and so the firewood seller sold him oak for the same price. So it's always worth asking, indeed. And the key there is that person in New York, if you say I'm selling campfire wood, you can put anything you want in that bundle. If you're selling hardwood firewood, there are specific species that are not included as hardwood firewood. Okay. All right, so John says, early picture had an ATV with a log trailer behind it, might have had a grapple. Do you have sources for these? Let me scroll back up to that. So if other people are looking at this, maybe they have an idea. Where did it go? Is this the picture? Is John still there? Is this the picture? Yes, so it's this thing right down here. So that's an ATV, and this was from a maple producer up in Quebec, is where I took that picture. So I don't know. I'm not sure where you would get those. So DR Mowers has a cart, a pull-behind cart that has, it's not a hydraulic grapple, but it's a hand winch grapple. I can't answer that. But I bet if you looked in some magazines like Northern Woodlands or what is it, Small Woodlot and Sawmill magazine, I may not be getting that exactly right. NIFOA's magazine, the New York Forest Owner, has advertisements. Many of these advertisements that show up, or most of the forestry fairs are over in New York. We have Boonville, so some of those would have equipment dealers. Thank you, Sawmill and Woodlot. All right. So the question, early picture had an ATV with log trailer behind it, may have a grapple. Source for these? No, I do not. Seems to be a huge jump between a $600, 1,500-pound trailer and something that will hold a couple of tons with a grapple at $15,000. I'm looking for something in the middle. So I don't know. I can't provide any insight into that, John. So if other people know some sources or a brand or a friend that has one, you can talk to John. And John, that's a great question to go to the Ning site with. And so what I'll do is I'll write a blog. As you're asking, I'll write a blog. I'll post the link to this webinar on the blog so that people can watch the archive. I'll post, if I'm able, there's some size restrictions on this file size, but if I can post a copy of the file, I will. And and then people have questions, that's a great place to go into the questions. So, all right, so Michael says, how much time do I have to harvest treetops after logging? Great question. It depends a little bit on the species. So as I mentioned earlier, paper birch, I have paper birch logs that develop fungal fruiting bodies within 12 months. I've had other wood, oak and maple and species where the tops are off the ground, so they're essentially in a drying process that would last for, I'll say, a few years, 3 years to probably 5 years is pushing it. So if you get to those tops within 2 or 3 years, for most species, you're probably going to be in good shape. So All right, great question, Ryan. I did not do it directly. He says, is there a general rule of thumb for guesstimating the weight of a felled tree to match the limit of tractors and winches and haulers? So what you would have to do, let me see if I can find those charts. So here's one chart. So this is showing, so we're looking at green wood runs about 4,400 pounds, so a little over 2 tons per cord. Okay, 2 tons per cord. So if you keep that number in your head, 2 tons per cord, 4,400 pounds per cord. And then you come down here and you say a 20-inch tree has 3/4 of a cord, and actually if you take it up to 22 inches, has 1 full cord. So a 22-inch tree down to a 4-inch top has 1 full cord, which is about 4,400 pounds. So you'll have to, there's not a straight up chart for that. That would be a good one to do though, but it's going to depend a lot on, you're probably not going to drag that tree out as a whole tree, right? You're going to chunk it up. You're going to maybe bring out a central stem section, which is going to have the majority of the weight, and then you might block up some of the limbs so you have 3 or 4 sections of wood. So John's provided a link there for log weights on the Forestry Forum pages. So Forestry Forum is another really good social media site. Alex says, is there a general rule of thumb for how long a hardwood log can sit on the forest floor before it's more rotten than usable? I asked this because the previous owner left a lot of stuff just lying on the ground for years. I'm trying to gauge how quickly I need to get to these. Well, it is or it isn't a tough answer. So what I do, and I have logs laying on my forest floor, not because of the previous owner, but because of the current owner. And so if I'm in doubt, I'll take out a hammer, just a regular hammer, and I'll ping the ends, right? Just kind of tap the ends. If you get a bounce back, then at least the end of that log is pretty solid. And if both ends of that log are pretty solid, then you're probably in pretty good shape. And it may be that you have, and you can do the same thing in the middle. So you can tap. Essentially, you're doing a tap test, and then see what that gives you. If you want to go to a little more effort, take your chainsaw out and cut up. If you know you're going to be cutting 18-inch pieces of wood, or 16 inches, or 22 inches, cut 2 or 3 pieces and see how it is. Now, what I found is as soon as you start to get zone lines, so these are lines, decay lines, fungal decay in the tree. I understand them to be kind of boundary lines between 2 competing fungi. As soon as I start to see those, you may have a different experience. What I have found is that as soon as you see those zone lines, when you try to split it, the wood just kind of crumbles apart. So if I'm seeing zone lines in wood that's on the ground, I just leave it in the woods. It's not worth the effort to take it out of the woods. So, all right. Well, I want to thank you all for a fun conversation. I'm sorry I ran over, but we had a good conversation. You all had some very good questions and comments and observations. I appreciate that. So have a great afternoon. Next month, we're going to be talking about deer and their impacts of deer on eastern hardwood forests. So stay tuned, the 3rd Wednesday in October.